Today's webinar is Managing Records Retention with AutoClassification and is presented in partnership with Valora. My name is Lynn Williams with the MER, and it is my great pleasure to welcome all of you today. So now I would like to introduce today's presenters. Sandy Serkis is CEO of Valora Technologies and a very frequent speaker at the MER conference. And Jennifer Nelson is the Marketing and Business Development at Valora. So Sandy and Jennifer, it's great to see you both again, and I'll turn it over to you now to start the webinar.
Awesome, thanks very much. Good afternoon, everyone.
Thank you.
Before I hand it off to Sandy, I'm just going to give a bit 30-second overview. If you're not familiar with Valora and who we are and what we do, my name is Jen Nelson. This is Sandy Serkis, and we are with Valora Technologies. And Valora Technologies is a software platform, an organization to help you locate, identify, and action content anywhere across the enterprise. We have a suite of technology. We partner that with methodology and best practices in information governance and auto classification. And we have a very experienced team of professional services and project managers that we work with to help our clients with their projects and with their success. We're going to get into what we mean by auto classification, what auto classification can do to help you, but we'll cover that in a little bit. So next slide. So before we kind of get into the meat of it, what we've done is put up a poll or a bit of a questionnaire just so we can get an idea of the kinds of folks that are on the call today. So the first question is just kind of lets us know what industry you're from today. So I'll give you a few seconds there to fill that in. Awesome. So there's the stats there. Great. So quite a mix. That's wonderful. Second question is, did you guys already see the second question?
No. Yeah?
No. Yes. Second question, what is your primary role at the organization? Didn't know if they all came up at once or if it was one at a time. So what is your primary role? And the answers, oh, excellent. Well, we're in good company. And the third question there is, what are your main concerns or priorities for your organization's IG practice? And kind of with a forward-looking into 2023.
I like that last one.
Okay. True, right? Awesome. That's really good. So that's great, and thank you for the feedback because it really helps us start to talk about and position the conversation to where you're coming from and what your main concerns are. Before we get into it, I just wanted to kind of echo what Lynn was saying. So there is a Q&A box, should be at the bottom of your screen. You can click on that and you can ask questions as we go. Sandy and I tend to go back and forth, so I have no problem interrupting Sandy, and Sandy has no problem interrupting me. So if you put your questions in there, we will get to them as they come up because it's a little more relevant sometimes as we're talking about a certain subject than waiting till the end. But if you prefer to wait to the end, that is no problem as well. And I'll keep my eye out for that. So next slide.
We're getting ready to walk and chew gum.
Walk and chew gum. So our agenda for today, we are going to have a bit just an auto classification 101 so that we're all on the same page about what we're talking about when we talk about data classification and more specifically auto classification. We're going to talk about automating records retention and the lifecycle management using specifically auto classification, a few tips on future-proofing your retention policies and automating that compliance, again, using auto classification technology. We're going to review a real-world case study with a client so we can see how they used and applied that technology with their problem or their project. And towards the end, we're going to talk about prioritizing IG. I mean, all of us around the table understand the importance, but sometimes it's a challenge getting the rest of the organization on board and making information governance a priority within your organization. So we'll talk about that and some ideas and tips and tricks on how to get folks around the table involved there. I will continue. What is classification? Before we get to the auto classification part, let's talk about what classification or data classification is. We are preaching to the choir here, so we all understand what classification is. It tells us kind of that DNA about the file. What kind is it? Who created it? What is, who is it to? Who is it from? With auto classification, what auto classification do is automate the process of classification. So we don't leave it up to a human to decide. It is always right. It is always the same answer every time. And it moves very fast and very quickly to classify or automate the classification of data. And we'll talk about how we do that. Sandy, do you want to take this one?
Sure, I'll actually back up for one quick second. One of the key benefits, the results that you get when you start to classify content is that you create a set of rich metadata that's the byproduct of that effort. And so a lot of people will ask me, well, don't I have metadata, or what am I going to use metadata for? And this is the best answer that I've ever heard, which is that metadata is the love note to the future, where you're taking all that information when you had the moment or the time to evaluate a file or a piece of content and store that in a way that's easily accessible in the future when you need to do a data purge, or you need to collect for litigation, or you need to run a DSAR request. So this was a really nice graphic, and I thought it very well explained the value of metadata.
I loved that. I thought that was really cute. So talking about a classification manually or automating, you can classify manually. But kind of the question to pose to yourself and the organization, is this the best use of your organization's time and resources? And almost more importantly, what will the quality be? What I call something, Sandy may call something differently. We all have the same options to classify something, but we may not have the same viewpoints or the same decision when we are manually classifying. So there are some dangers there with manually classifying things. When we automate classification, this is where the software can help us and help IG teams and records managers automate that analysis. So it's going to be the same answer and the same decision every time. Every time this certain piece of content comes up, there will be no errors. It will always be the same classification, the same metadata.
All right, should I take over here, Jen?
You want to? Yeah.
Sure. Okay. So it's not actually a robot picking up files and classifying them, although it's kind of close. And with AI and machine learning, it's a fine line these days. But what's really going on is essentially an assessment or a parsing of the content of a file. So what do we mean by that? Any kind of text that's in there, any kind of metadata that might already exist, like system metadata, when was it created, last modified, that kind of stuff. And then an analysis of that content to address questions of interest, typically different types of attributes about the document. Who wrote it? What are the keywords? What are the dates? What kind of document? That sort of thing. And that takes us to the next one, is where that kind of classification effort is run against algorithms to say, oh, this is a hospital admission form, this is a payroll stub, this is a sales forecast. And once you kind of have that document type, a whole host of things open up in terms of capability, because we treat different documents differently. I think I saw 70 or 75% records managers on this call. You guys surely understand the value of being able to determine a document type. And we use that phrase that's different than sort of file extension. So I could say, you know, this is a JPEG, this is an Excel, this is a PDF. And you know from your experience that a PDF could frankly be anything. When we get to the level of document type, we are now being very specific about what that file actually is. And that's going to set us up to the records classification pieces of, okay, well, if it's an offer letter to an employee, then I know it's going to get classified under this record class under personnel, you know, the personnel bucket. So this is where doc type starts to play a really big role. And then finally, there are what we call disposition algorithms. Once we have this information kind of all tagged up, the rules and actions allow us to take action on that piece of content. Oh, it's a duplicate. Oh, it's past retention. Oh, it's under legal hold. These would be actions that you would take or not take, depending on that kind of status. So what happens is kind of a sequence of events. There's a tagging step. These are things that might come from, you know, kind of existing system metadata, supplemented by this rich metadata creation or extraction from the AutoClassification, where you can basically, these are typically captured as fields. You can kind of capture almost anything that might be of interest. There are things that are kind of standard across the board. Everybody wants date, doc type, title, author, but not everybody needs well number or patent number or inventory SKU. Those would be unique for different types of industries, but very much gettable in the same fashion. And so what we start to do, like Jen mentioned, is kind of DNA sequence every piece of content using this kind of automated technique. It sounds a little complex and kind of heavy lifting, which it would be for a person if you were trying to classify 50, 60 fields. Piece of cake for software, and it just rips through doing, you know, thousands of these a second, maybe millions. So once we have those kind of innate attributes, give me everything there is to know about this file, then we can start to segment. So these are the kind of things that make it a personnel file. These are the kinds of things that make it financial. These are the kinds of things that make it sensitive. So there's different ways that you might bucket up your content. It doesn't always have to be records. Records would certainly be a very common bucket, but it's not the only bucket. And files can belong to more than one bucket. You can be a record and be sensitive, or you can be sensitive and a duplicate. So this is what I mean by segmenting. And then finally, once we kind of have that path laid out, then you can start to take those disposition actions. So those typically follow an if-then type of conditional format. So if certain circumstances are met, then go ahead and take the action. So here's a very kind of recordsy type of example. If the document type is a contract and it has not reached the end of its effective date or its term, then consider it active and retain it for the current year or the effective date or whatever you want to consider your time starting point +7. So computers are also very good at math. So they can look at dates and go, oh, well, we're, you know, well into 2022. This will expire on this date and we're 48% of the way there. So it's not only tracking kind of what is past retention, it's also kind of tracking what's coming up for retention and when. So that essentially on any day of the week, you could always see what is newly ready to be disposed of. Once you kind of understand that concept, that the rules kind of direct the action based on those metadata attributes, you can see two of them here in italics. then you realize you can take lots of actions. It's not just assign record or go ahead and do disposition. You can kind of do a lot of different things. And this is where records management, information governance starts to make friends elsewhere in the organization, because that same effort that you will undertake to evaluate what content is and classify it appropriately is going to help out other organizations that also need to do this. Number one, legal, okay? They need to tag, they won't call it that, they might call it document review, same effort. They need to essentially apply metadata to the files to look for things like legal hold or responsive to a request for production. They might need, it's responsive to a subject access request. Other groups that might pick up along the way would be like knowledge management. They need to understand what content says and what it contains. So you're going to start to find friends in other organizations if you position this not just as, well, I'm out hunting records. If you're out classifying data and the byproduct is that you'll be all recorded up, the other byproducts are that you'll also be all data privacy up and all, litigation ready. So you can start to build a lot of goodwill and support for efforts like this.
Sandy, there's a question from the group. How long does it take the software to learn retention rules and document types?
Oh, okay. I'll take those separately. So learning retention rules is actually quite fast. What we typically will do is, in all cases, there's a sort of out of the box. If a client said, we don't have any retention rules, believe it or not, it does happen. Then we will have a set of generics that we will recommend to them. More likely, though, they are going to come to us and say, wham, here's our record retention schedule, which hopefully doesn't have our highest watermark so far, 560 record classes. That's you. Please, clean that up. But assuming they come to us, let's say, with a slightly more reasonable number, and even if not, what we do is the rules get built for the record class. So there's typically a rule per record class. That sounds complicated. The system spits those out. So that's going to take maybe a couple days just to kind of go through the record retention schedule, build the rules, and then test them. We always test those results to make sure that it's performing the way we want. It's also where we're going to find things like this record class and this record class conflict with each other, which one should win when. So that's when that kind of stuff gets kind of banged out. That's how we handle record class. Document types is actually very similar. There's a couple dozen, maybe 100 or so standard doc types that are going to come out of the box. And it's the ones you can name off the top of your head. Email, letter, spread, various types of spreadsheets, cash flow statement, that kind of thing. Things that are going to be pretty common anywhere. So what we will typically do is start sampling the data and see which ones are coming up on the default doc type templates. And then ones that are not, that have like kind of a low match or no match, those are the ones we're going to look at and go, hey, these must be things that are unique to this customer or this industry. And those are the ones that we're going to kind of hand tweak. And that effort usually does a little bit depend on the total scope of your data and how varied it is. But you're probably on the order of 3 to 4 weeks to get that nailed down. The good news is you don't need every doc type on day one. You can always add that, layer them in later. If you don't have, the same is true actually of record schedule. You don't need everything on day one. You can always add or tweak. You just tweak the kind of configuration and run again. So it's not like you need the whole world set up on day one. You can roll with it. So hopefully that answered. That was a good question. Any others so far, Jen?
Not yet. That's it.
Okay. So let's move ahead. So in a nutshell, if you need to explain auto classification in like 5 seconds or less to someone in your organization, here's how to do it. And thank you to Jen for coming up with this. Auto classification turns this, in other words, this is what it looks like in File Explorer under Windows. I have no info here, basically, into this. Boom. Here's a picture of your document, and that's usually something we do is kind of make like a preview image. Here's a picture with everything kind of fielded out, all the data elements of importance. So in this case, a contract, what are you going to want to know in a contract? The expiration date, the parties, various terms, things like that. And whatever else, certain clients have to have, again, there's a lot of customization available. That's what the orange is. I'm sorry, I bumped it again. The orange is that kind of just simple tagging. Then the blue here is, of course, now we've entered records territory. This is where we're doing those rules and that kind of assessment and kind of disposition calculations where we're really saying, okay, what is this? Okay, it's a certain kind of contract. It's this type of record class. Therefore, it has this type of expiration. And today's date is what? And where are we? And some other things that tend to get lumped into this category. Is it a duplicate? And if it's a duplicate, is it what we call the master? So in a series of duplicates, let's say you have 5, which is the one that should dominate the other 4? So sometimes you'll see that type of field. How sensitive is this information? Is it public facing, business, material, confidential, highly confidential? These are all things that might affect the handling and treatment going forward. And then ultimately what most clients are after is, of course, okay, I now know exactly what it is, soup to nuts. I know exactly how I want to classify it for records and for handling. The big question, keep it or don't keep it. And the good news here is you will get a yes, no answer, retain yes, no, but you will also get a rationale. Retain no. Why? It's a duplicate. Or retain no, it's past retention, or everybody's favorite coming right up. Retain no, it's rot. So I'll walk you through some of those.
Mm-hmm. Sandy, before you move on, I've just got a few questions here. I was going to type it into the chat box, but I thought we'd just chat about it live. It was from the same person who had asked the first question, saying thanks for answering the question. And to clarify, would my workplace create the rules, or does Valora work with us to create the rules? Thinking about resource planning.
Yeah, typically Valora sets up the rules for the clients. That said, it's not terribly difficult. And this is really more of a client preference. Do you have the resources and the kind of inclination to either set up or perhaps modify rules over time? Some clients really do. They want that kind of command and control of the system, in which case we will just show you how to do that. Again, not very tricky. If you can do a simple, let's say, Excel macro, you can write rules. Other clients are like, oh no, we're not going anywhere near that kind of thing. No scripting here. So we will do that on their behalf and just kind of have that kind of conversation. And what you guys will find is once you start down this path, it opens up all kinds of, hey, could we do those kind of questions? Like, hey, could we look for client names inside here? Yes, of course we could. So that would be something that we would add. Or, hey, could we look for things that were part of a such and such deal? And, these are the kind of attributes that would define that. Sure, of course. So we get into those kind of, hey, could we type of discussions with clients, very common. And then it's really just a question of who's literally going to be the tush in the seat to key up the rule. There is a cute little UI for it. It is pretty easy to do. Some clients like it, some clients don't. Your choice.
Mm-hmm. Good. Second question, kind of on this vein as well. Once the auto classification is created, or the rules, how hard is it to update if your records retention schedule changes?
which happens all the time. It's not very hard at all. It's the same kind of, I mean, that's where like editing a rule is super easy. The rule, I don't have a picture of the rule UI in this presentation, but anybody, contact me offline or contact Jen, will send you a little screenshot of that. You basically, if you want to change something, let's say from 5 years to 7 years, you go in, you find the 5, you change it to 7, apply, go. So it's pretty easy to do that. One of the things that's happening in the background, a lot of people don't appreciate this right at the beginning, is that there is a constant kind of perpetual reassessment of the content. So the software is kind of always running, and you can think of that the way like Google crawls websites. It's not like they crawled the website in 2014 and then left it. They come back and they crawl them almost daily, so that when you run a search in 2022, it's up to date. So the same thing is happening here with auto classification. So if you make a change, I want to change this from 5 to 7, it's going to go back through and cause that to happen so that you're not out of sync with yourself. So the actual making the change is very quick and very simple. And then there's the kind of come back around and make sure your content reflects that change. Just so you know, that often takes about 24 hours to get fully through everything. But you can kind of see the progress. You'll know, oh, we're here, we're here, we're here. But we tell people to kind of expect 24 hours on that kind of thing.
Right.
Okay. All right. So this was, again, we're kind of high level. What really is auto classification? It's this to this. All right. So since the questions have already come up, let's just walk on through. So this is really what's happening. I've kind of described a lot of this already. The first thing is there's going to be some sort of crawl, and somebody's going to ask this question, so I'll just answer it now. It's an agent. An agent is a tiny little piece of software that does 2 things and only 2 things. It literally crawls and goes, what's that? That's it. And then steps away. So crawling is very quick, and crawlers are set up for all the places where you would normally store content. Number 1, file shares. Number 2, email. Number 3, SharePoint. You get the point. And every other place, all those web applications that are out there, like Salesforce or what have you. So the agents go and kind of do their little bit. They crawl. They sort of report back to base and say, okay, I've got a file of blah, blah, blah contents over there. And the tagging starts, all that rich, kind of delicious metadata, 50, 60 fields of metadata. Then that actioning, okay, what do we think we need to do with that one based on its segmenting, based on its bucketing, based on the rules that have been set up. And then we're ready. Then we're like prior to here. Once you get to here, you now have a curated system, right? Because everything has been assessed, everything has been tagged, and if you're good, everything has been actioned. So now you're ready to employ. Now comes along the next, litigation request, the next time to, do records disposition, or the next DSAR. Now you're ready. Because everything's been tagged, you can do that kind of stuff in a couple of seconds because you have the full information at your fingertips. So you can do that, or this is the golden opportunity now to have the rest of your organization self-serve. You don't have to do everything. They can do it themselves. You've set it up for them. And you're going to see that theme very much so when we get to the customer case study. So from there, and I just kind of touched on this a moment ago, we monitor. We go back through what's changed in the data. The question was asked about, what if we want to change some of the rules, like a retention rule? Sure, that's a change. But another thing that can change is more data shows up, because more data always shows up. So what the software is doing is kind of monitoring what's new. We sometimes call that delta monitoring, delta for change. What is new? New data, new rules, new regulations, new users, you name it. I guarantee you every day of the week. So there is something new. So the software needs to pay attention to that. And then finally, expand. You're going to hear this in the case study as well. I do not recommend boiling the ocean. Do not start with your entire set of data. Start with a couple of file shares, an email system, a department, something. Make that a super success and then expand out. Because what naturally starts to happen is the content that has been tagged and curated and kind of made clean becomes kind of coveted by everyone else. Like, well, I want my content to look like that, or I want access to that. It naturally kind of self-seeds across an organization. So that's what we talk about in terms of expanding. Any questions, Jen?
We've been, yeah, I've got some questions. We've been kind of back and forth because the chat is disabled. So we're just kind of going back and forth with questions. Okay. And some of them have been answered, and I think everybody can see those questions and how they're being answered. So, you know, crawling the cloud, crawling SharePoint. Yes, we can crawl on-prem and cloud as well. But I thought I'd kind of bring it into discussion because now we're a question about SharePoint specifically. If we already have a SharePoint site with tags, do you need to retag?
That's a great question. And the answer is no. Absolutely, you can inherit existing tags. SharePoint is good about tags. Many other systems are less good. One thing I will caution you, though, is if you're trying to map across different sources of data, in particular, it could be even different SharePoint sites, there may be different ways that they've been set up. So, for example, one SharePoint site calls it recipient, and another SharePoint site calls it to. So one of the things that AutoClassification will do is make a common language across all your data stores. So if in this one you call it employee and in this one you call it associate, those you're going to be able to kind of speak both languages for like a universal translator. So yes, it can absolutely inherit both the field value and the field or tag name, but it can also do that kind of transformation if you need to kind of institute some consistency across systems. So I'm getting kind of fancy here, but we sometimes see that with SharePoint, so I wanted to put it out there.
Mm-hmm. And another question here, you know, asking about Teams as well. And, you know, because everything's built on SharePoint, Teams, OneDrive, all of that kind of Microsoft universe is can be scanned and accounted for as well.
That's correct. And the magic key you're looking for is the Microsoft Graph API. So the Graph API is the SharePoint API that lets you speak Teams and SharePoint and OneDrive, et cetera. So yes, those can all be kind of seamlessly incorporated. Teams is kind of the new player, but it works very nicely through the same graph that's GRAPH API.
Mm-hmm. And just one more question before we go on talking about crawling. How often does it crawl?
That is really a function of a number of things. It's almost like saying, you know, how often do you want some chocolate? If you're me, the answer is constantly.
All the time.
Yeah, constantly, keep it coming. But, you know, there are some practical, you don't want that when you're sleeping. You probably don't want that when you're eating soup, although maybe I would try that. So there are other, so similarly, you can set things up to constantly recrawl, like, you know, recrawl every night or recrawl different, you know, you can set different priorities, recrawl this area more frequently than that area. Or you may have them trigger after an event, recrawl it when, you know, oh, I'm just trying to think of something. Recrawl it when after the antivirus has run, so they don't conflict. So there's a number of different criteria that go into that. At the most basic level, you can recrawl anywhere from every 10 seconds to never. I would not recommend never. What we find most clients do for everyone's sanity is high priority areas recrawl maybe every 2 weeks or every month. Lower priority areas maybe every 3 months, 6 months, maybe even every year, but something that doesn't change very often. The other thing you want to look at is bandwidth. When do you want to recrawl? Do you want to recrawl no matter what time of day, or do you only want to crawl or recrawl between the hours of midnight and 6 a.m.? So there's all kinds of variables that go into the crawl sequence and cadence, but every one of them is customizable. But there are some kind of best practices, and as a safe, rule of thumb, say 30 days and you'll be fine. Okay?
Yeah, we're good.
All right, we're good. Excellent.
Thank you.
Please keep these questions coming. They're excellent. All right, so I kind of mentioned this in the beginning. You guys know this, that records doesn't really live in a vacuum. It has to interplay with some of these other areas. And records is kind of a main component under information governance, but it's not the only one. And these are the biggest use cases that we see. And I thought I would present that to you because, again, this is where your buddies are. These are where your fellow advocates, you're going to find them. So what's really nice about auto classification, data classification in general, is that it's going to support all of these use cases. So rather than saying, oh, we need 6 different systems, you really don't. You really only need one, and you're going to cover off all of these things. So you're going to make a lot of different people happy, and you're going to be able to lean on a lot of other budgets, notably legal and data security. So those in most organizations we talk to, that's where the big budgets lie. And so this is your ticket to getting your hands on that. All right. So I'm going to walk you through now how it works. I'm going to show you some examples. We did one in the beginning. You may remember I kind of showed you how you go from one line item to this. Let's look at some others. So this is how we find rot. Let's say either this was, an attachment or the body of somebody's email back in 2014, very common practice then. Or even worse, the common practice now, people are worried about the what I call kind of like, the angel of death coming by and wiping out their emails every 180 days. So they store them somewhere else. They pull down their PSTs or whatever off into a file share. So now you have these things floating around as singleton messages or part of a PST. So no matter how you slice it, this is rot, redundant, obsolete, trivial. You guys all know that. So how is it that we determine that this is rot? Same way that people do. We have, kind of a watch list of words that almost never have any kind of business or regulatory value. We can look at the date getting older and older every time I give this presentation. There's no other content to speak of. So what we kind of call the signal to noise ratio, in other words, the signal being text, the noise being graphics usually, it's very poor. And there's 4,000 identical copies because well-meaning person sent it to everybody in the company on Christmas Eve. And so now we get to that. So now we know what it is. There's all that tagging, tag. Now we get to that kind of records or life cycle management. Is it rot? Of course it's rot. And it's going to be identified as rot. And just like the other, like, should we retain it or not? We had a rationale. You can have the same thing here. Is it rot? Yes. What's the rationale? That's all the stuff in orange. The rationale, it has these words. It's past retention. It has no business value. It has no keywords. Blah, 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 blah. Okay? So that you will always have kind of a leg to stand on and a proof of defensibility about why things get classified the way they do. Obviously, it's not a record, so hopefully the rest of this no longer applies and frankly should be deleted as soon as possible. Okay, let's take something a little more sophisticated. And this is going to lead us very nicely into our case study. So this is a very funny letter. If you read this, I found this just floating out on the internet. I don't think it's real, but it is terminating Mr. Jacobson here for complete and utter lack of attendance and initiative and everything else. So this is going to be kind of a key document, right? This is clearly going to be a record. It is recording the termination of an employee. No question that it is a record, and it will show up somewhere in your record schedule. It's a record class, blah, 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 blah. However, there's more to it than that, because if you look closely, this document also contains Mr. Jacobson's home address. So now we have entered into personal data. Can I identify him from that? You bet I can. It also has his supervisor. This is sensitive 10 times over. So it's a record, but it's sensitive. My guess is, from what I've seen of termination letters, there's 15 copies of this floating around, some signed, some unsigned. So here we go. Begins the auto classification. In this case, I kind of talked about it as having a primary and a secondary doc type. This is pretty important for records folks. Every time we say to people, oh, make fewer buckets, what that does is kind of make them broader. And so you get a bucket like correspondence, which is going to cover email, letter, memo, fax, phone call, video. That's a pretty broad bucket. So that's where you see the secondary doc type, very specific termination letter. That is what's going to feed into, of course, the record class determination. You have both. You may just want to think, give me all correspondence related to Jacobson. Fine, you have that, but you also have the granularity. That's a very common theme with auto classification, where you have kind of the high level and the detail, depending on what you need when. So it's going to continue through, give me everything you can find. And note this, the employee ID is not present on this document, but the employee name is. And so one of the things, again, a sophisticated system is going to hook up other systems and data sources. So maybe this file is living out in a file share somewhere, and somewhere else there's an HRM system or some other, employee data source. So the crawler, remember the crawler in the beginning? What we call it a transfer agent. One of them goes to look at the file. Another one goes to look at the database and says, give me Jacobson's employee ID. Pulls it back in here so that you can see the two of them at the same time. Why might you want that? Because your legal hold list is by employee ID, not by name. Or you have 15 Eric Jacobsons. Which one? We have had that recently, but company had 14 John Smiths. Which one? That one. So this is where you can get really sophisticated with this stuff. And whatever else, obviously this is the kind of record that is usually going to get its retention triggered by an event, the termination, and this is effective with this letter. So that's the date. That's the effective date. That's what should trigger the retention calculation. Other important things you might want to track, different types of keywords. It's going to pull those out either automatically, or you can say, you can always supply a list. If it mentions anything like this, go ahead and flag that. Theft, that's always a good one. Embezzlement, harassment. Those are, we have those as defaults, but you might have your own terminology or issues that you always want tracked. So again, we go through, we tag. Then we say, okay, what happens with this? Well, obviously, this goes under termination. It's a personnel record. Therefore, we keep it 7 years from that critical moment termination date, which can, in this case, is coming from the letter, but it could also, the way this one did, it could also come from a database lookup. So you have a couple options on that, and you can verify one against the other if you need to do that. Mention the sensitivity, mention the personal data. And here again, you see that high level, more detail. High level personal data, yes. What? Home address. Okay. I think everybody's got it by now. All right. So these are the typical rotten retention classification tags that we would recommend. these are the high level. There's plenty underneath this, but if you kind of want to see what the fan favorites are, these are they. And some of these are a direct kind of just what is the result of the analysis, and the other is a little bit more of that rule, kind of taking things together and saying, if this, if that, and this, then do this. So these come from different ways, but all of them become populated and for each piece of content assessed. And the net result of all of that effort is that you get the single pane of glass, which is, let me look across all those data sources, SharePoint, email, 16 file shares, so-and-so's laptop, and let me see a consolidated single pane of glass across them all. And each of these becomes the various attributes. So let me see it by custodian, let me see it by document type, let me see it by record class, let me see it by duplicate, et cetera, et cetera. As long as it's been assessed in that first step, what was orange in all of my previous slides, you're going to see that presented up in this kind of really rich and gorgeous UI that you can then click around and search and drill down and all the things that you would expect in a dashboard type of UI. So this is kind of, in some ways, this is the end result, but this is really only it's the beginning, because once you get here, now you go, okay, let's delete this and move that and protect this and send an alert on that. Like, this is your command center, and now you get to fly. If you want, I just picked out a couple to show you a little more detail. Some of these are on that picture, some of them are underneath. But if you want to kind of see, like, this is just kind of a zoom in view. This is what, expiration handling. So not everything, it's not just keep or delete. Sometimes there has to be a quarantine period. Some things never expire. Some things we have to have a discussion about, etc. So you can kind of see what that looks like. Again, because we are actively calculating the retention period and therefore what we call the expiration date, we know when that is. You can zoom in on that. This is kind of a high level view. Of course, you can, well, show me stuff in the 2020s and 2022 and September and 15th, and you can kind of see what's either past retention, what's coming up soon, and what does the future look like. This is just drilling down. And then, everybody's favorite part, here it is in a kind of more tabular view. Each one of these is a file, let's say from a file share, with all of its kind of rich metadata populated in. So you can see, oh, well, this was, a purchase document. It's supposed to be quarantined. It expired in 2018. Guess what? Past retention, etc. And this goes on. I mean, as I said, usually about 50, 60 fields. I only am showing you 5 or 6 for sanity on this call.
Hey, Cindy, there's a question from the group. So how does this change searchability? Is searchability still whatever's out of the box with each repository, like Windows search for file shares?
It's a great question. So nothing changes in like kind of the host place of where the documents actually live. So one thing I should mention is the documents don't actually live here. It looks like they live here, but it is a virtual dashboard. The documents still are where they are. Remember, we sent the little agent out to go, what you got? Okay, I'm done. It leaves the file there. So there's no, unless you want it, there's no file movement. So you can always go back to the host system and do what you were going to do. You can search there, whatever. But you can also go here and you can either search within the confines of the way, kind of that common language across them all, or you can search in the language of whatever host system and only those things will come up. So you can kind of have it either way. So I would hope that your searchability is greatly enhanced.
Mm-hmm. And I think what that offers, again, in that one dashboard, bringing it into that one view, you're not only now searching SharePoint site or your OneDrive or your email. It's Salesforce, it's your ERP, or it's your HRM. It's everything about that one, whatever you're looking for.
Yes. I mean, you can drill down in it. You can make it so. I only want to see SharePoint, but it's not necessarily so. That's you do that.
There's one other question here. Can't access the chat. So yes, there will be printouts sent with the recording email as well. So you'll get a copy of these slides as well.
Okay, I'll continue on. Oh, and we're running out of time. So
I know, I was just going to say, we're running short on time.
All right, so you know what? I'm going to skip over these. You guys can read these ones later.
Yeah.
And I'm actually going to skip over this one too. If you've heard me speak at MER, I talk about this quite a bit. So I'm going to skip over this. And what I'm trying to get to, we kind of covered this, is here. So I wanted to talk with you a little bit about one of our clients. Here's a quick snapshot of who they are. They're a huge tech company. They operate globally, and they grow like many large companies by acquisition. And over the years, there were about 140, now they're up to about 150 unique acquisitions. And we were working with a group who's literally called HR M&A. And this is the group that is responsible for receiving all of the personnel documents from everything that they've ever acquired since 1994. So the early ones are scanned paper, and then there's a ton that are in email, and it is like everything you can think of. Almost everything is a record, almost, not everything. And they have tons and tons and tons of duplicates. And a lot of it is past retention, because one of the interesting wrinkles with this client is they inherited, when you inherit the company, you inherit all the files, you also inherit their record keeping. So we have to do this kind of mapping between acquired companies' record schedule, if they had one, and acquirers, and then make that translation. So quite a lot of activity here, quite a lot of challenge, but a very forward-thinking, smart client. And people ask me this sometimes. This is technically for HR M&A, but it was funded by legal. So if you're looking for kind of where do the dollars come from? So that was the kind of initial starting point. Again, here's a little more detail on that. Every time they needed to find something for litigation purpose, for subject access purpose, even just for general inquiry, they had to go and look at literally 150 different locations. And it would take them days and days and days to get an answer that they kind of crossed their fingers and hoped was okay. And so as they are trying, like nearly every organization, trying to become more efficient, do business transformation, get stuff streamlined and whatnot, they decided it was time to get this under control. And they got a big boost from their records folks, because the records folks were able to show that they were not in compliance across the board with what their stated policies for record keeping are. And so they got a big boost from legal with that, because they recognized that they were not in compliance with their own policies and that that was unacceptable. So that is how this kind of got off the ground. It wound up going through 3 phases. The most common phase, and what I would recommend for everybody, is that you do a pilot in the beginning. Take a small piece of content, take a portion of your records retention schedule, take a subset of the rules that you will ultimately build, and just do a quick and dirty proof of concept, essentially. Do what we call core samples. Let's just get an overarching view, take a look at what this stuff is, what kind of problems we have, what it's going to look like, scope it out, and then bridge it into the full go forward, which is kind of the technique that we recommend. Bridge is where you're growing in scale. All right, let's bring on the rest of the record retention schedule. Let's bring on the rest of the content, the rest of the people, and get into that high volume, kind of classify all 14 file shares. And this is where, this is precisely the method that we followed with the client I was just telling you about. And what has happened, this is an older slide, is that we have found ourselves now in a stage 4, where that was so very effective for the HR M&A team and for legal at large that they have now decided to expand that out to all of HR. This is corporate-wide HR, not just M&A. It was so effective and so easy to find things that were related to M&A that it begged the question of, well, what about the other 90,000 employees who did not come from an acquisition? How to find all that for them? And so, of course, now we have the whole enchilada. And so this is just a very good example when I said earlier about what does it mean to expand out. Here's a perfect example. And the time frame went from a typical pilot, generally allocate maybe 3 months, maybe a little less. And then the bridge is, again, a couple months. Then the go forward is typically going to be on the order of about a year. Expand out is going to be forever. And that is where, this is the holy grail. Everything classified, tagged, monitored forever. End of story. So that is, just to kind of give you some numbers on this. And this team, this HR M&A team, has become the absolute company role model for successful, compliant records and information management. They are literally going around the world giving presentations about how to do this right. And that is the position you want to be in. They have, this is their number, not mine. I don't know. I don't do the work they do. That they have gone from days and days and days to seconds. And it has made all the difference in the world. So this is what we think of as an extremely strong, productive, good, answer. So we are kind of at the end of the mark. I'm happy to stick around a little. I don't know if Shelley and Lynn are okay with that. Whatever you need me to do.
Yeah, why don't we see how many more questions come in at the end? But to just respect those who might need to leave at the top of the hour, let's just, if we could just go to the upcoming webinar slide. That'd be great.
Yeah, we're getting there.
And I do want to thank you both for this presentation. And let's see if we can, climb back on at the end of this, if there's more to present or more questions.
Sure.
But I do want to just make everyone aware of some upcoming webinars that we have. So ZL Technologies will be with us on Tuesday, September 27th. And then looking into October, on the 6th, we have Preservica presenting Managing the Retention of Long-Term High-Value Records in Microsoft 365, planning and getting started. And then on the 20th, Collegal will be with us as well. So we'll be announcing more webinars in the coming weeks. Check out our website at mersapient.com for the most up-to-date listing. And if you've missed any of our webinars and you'd like to go back and look at them, you can do that as well on our website. So next slide, please. To receive more update information on the various MER products, I invite you to join our mailing list at MER. It's at the bottom of the homepage on merconference.com. And please don't forget to take our survey for today's program. Your feedback is really important to us. So Jennifer and Sandy, any more questions coming in, or is there more there are more questions coming in? Why don't you go ahead and take a few of those?
Happy to do that.
There are, yeah. I was just about to kind of type them in there. There's a few questions. So we're talking about crawling laptops. Would you have an agent installed on every company device?
No. What we would do is install at the point at where the laptop. Once the laptop is on the network, a single agent will take that rather than install onto the device. We would prefer the device hook up onto the network and pick it up at that point. That saves us having to send an agent onto every device.
Excellent. Another question, are there any file extension types that cannot be crawled?
That's a good question. There are some incredibly archaic or corrupt. The typical thing, if you can't open it, generally, we're not going to be able to crawl it, probably. And then, very obscure, custom-y applications, unless there's an API or some way to open the file, then those won't be. I'm thinking like sometimes, very obscure CAD drawing type things or music, things that are maybe kind of out there, but your basic kind of business files should be pretty doable.
There is, I'm just saying yay with a smiley face. There's
Thank you for narrating this because I can't see them, so it's great.
That's right. I think that's all the questions. I think everyone can see the answers. Some I've typed in, some I haven't, but I'm hoping that everybody can see those in there that I have. Oh, here's another question. What about file size? Are there any restrictions on crawling?
Oh, that's a great question. We haven't hit that yet, but I don't want to go so far as to say there's no restriction. I'm sure there's some sort of incredibly, ridiculously gigantic file that might present a problem. I don't know where that mark would be, but theoretically, I'll bet there is a limit. In practice, we have not hit that yet.
That looks like there's one more question. Oh, thank you, Renee. Other question, what about multiple languages? Are there any that cannot be crawled?
With Valora, we license our auto translation from Google. So any translated language that Google supports, and I think they're up to like 180 at this point, we're going to support. So, even things like, Urdu and Eskimo. And so I think we're pretty covered on that one.
I'm so slow with the opens. Just a second. Oh, does this system live on our servers?
The system can live wherever you want. Most clients will opt for a SaaS approach where it lives with Valora, or maybe it lives in maybe a client tenant on AWS or Azure. But it can also live completely behind a firewall or inside client cloud if that is preferred. There are also some that are hybrid.
Excellent.
Okay, so I'd love to thank you all for attending. You got some great questions coming in. This is fabulous. Yeah. And you can continue to, respond to those offline if you'd like.
Sure.
I want to thank you both so much for today's program, and thank you all for attending. And I hope we'll see you again on the next MER Sapient webinar. So have a great remainder of your day, everyone.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Take care.